My argument is not that belief in God is necessary in order to do good or live a moral life or be a decent chap. The argument has nothing to do about belief in God. The argument is that without God, there isn't any absolute standard of right and wrong, and therefore what we call moral values are just the spin-offs of socio-biological evolution. Altruism, like you mentioned, self-sacrificial behavior, a mother rushing into a burning building.
No, specifically not a mother to save a child, because there's a perfectly good reason for a mother saving the child.
Well, but if you say that, see, then again, you're still misunderstanding my argument. What I was going to say is that on the socio-biological point of view, that kind of altruistic behavior is just the selfish gene wanting to perpetuate itself, and it's the same kind of behavior you see in a troop of baboons, where you see what looks like altruistic behavior, or even in an ant heap, where fighter ants will sacrifice themselves for the good of the heap. My point is that on the atheistic view, that's all moral values are.
Is that right? Let's clear that
up. And I would like to
ask... Is there any difference, Lewis? You come back in 1 second, but let me just ask Lewis whether there is any difference between the altruistic behavior of a human being, somebody who may sacrifice him or herself for a cause which will bring them no particular benefit, and a baboon.
Well, there are occasions where there are groups of animals where there's someone who will scream when danger comes, and therefore the thing. So these can be biologically determined, but also there's the whole complex of the nature of the sociology of the society and how different societies behave, and that's got nothing to do with God. That's complex sociology and biology.
Oh, so
and who imposed the complex biology? Where did that come from?
Well, evolution.
Right.
Yeah, we're back to the old...
No, see, that's my argument. That is all that moral values are on atheism, and that therefore, as I say, rape, child abuse, these may be socially inconvenient, or taboo.
Sorry, as an atheist, I'm not a rapist.
You're misunderstanding my argument. Of course you're not.
Thank
you. You're misunderstanding the argument. I'm not arguing that to be a good person, you have to believe in God. What I'm arguing is that without God, there is no absolute moral values, no absolute moral duties. We are like advanced primates, and what we call moral values are just these ingrained socio-biological patterns.
Yes, that's exactly what they are.
Okay, so that is your view. I was not sure of that. Well, then you see, when you make these moral judgments yourself, you're acting inconsistently with your own worldview. When you make moral judgments like everyone has the right to believe whatever he wants so long as it doesn't interfere with others. Where does this notion of rights suddenly come from? That's just
history and sociology.
Right, just sociologically ingrained behavior. So the pedophile or the rapist or the psychopath or the person who wants to be a religiously intolerant persecutor is just acting out of fashion. He's like the person who belches at a meal.
Hitler wasn't acting out of fashion. He acted in his particular way, which other people objected to.
Right, but there wasn't anything morally wrong with what he did, right, on your view?
Of course there was.
It was just contrary to the patterns of socio-biological behavior that have been ingrained into the human species, not to kill each other off. Why was what he did objectively wrong?
Because it killed many people and made people extremely unhappy.
All right, but now that goes on all the time in the animal kingdom, right?
No.
Killing other animals.
No, that does not.
Well, when a lion kills a zebra...
Oh, when a lion kills a zebra...
Kills it to eat,
what about when you kill your turkey? Be careful with turkeys at the moment.
Yes. Well, fine, use that example. On atheism, these are all morally neutral acts because there isn't any standard of right and wrong.
Sure, there isn't.
Okay, so you agree with and what we call moral values are just these ingrained socio-biological patterns.
Yes, that's exactly what they are.
Okay, so that is your view. I was not sure of that. Well, then you see, when you make these moral judgments yourself, you're acting inconsistently with your own worldview. When you make moral judgments like everyone has the right to believe whatever he wants so long as it doesn't interfere with others. Where does this notion of rights suddenly come from? That's just
History and sociology.
right, just sociologically ingrained
Yes.
behavior. So the pedophile or the rapist or the psychopath or the person who wants to be a religiously intolerant persecutor is just acting out of fashion. He's like the person who belches at a meal.
No, Hitler wasn't acting out of fashion. He acted in his particular way, which other people objected to.
Right, but there wasn't anything morally wrong with what he did, right, on your view?
Of course there was.
It was just contrary to the patterns of socio-biological behavior that have been ingrained into the human species, not to kill each other off. Why was what he did objectively wrong?
Because it killed many people and made people extremely unhappy.
All right, but on atheism, these are all morally neutral acts because there isn't any standard of right and wrong.
Sure, there isn't.
Wrong.
Sure, there isn't.
Wrong.
Sure, there isn't.
Now that's an interesting value judgment that you're making. And I'd like to know, on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, on what basis can you make that value judgment between these two separate societies and cultures?
Why do I think a society is better that doesn't have slaves?
Yes, why is our set of values which abhor slavery superior to any other cultures which adheres to slavery? Why characterize this as a moral improvement rather than just a difference?
Well, it certainly is a difference, and the reason I think it's a moral improvement is that all of us have things to offer, and slavery denies large numbers of people the chance to achieve everything that they have to offer to us. And I happen to think we live in a pluralistic society, and the essence of our society is that everyone gets a chance to contribute, everyone gets the chance to throw out their ideas.
But that wasn't the essence of ancient Hebrew society, right? I mean,
oh, no.
So why are you imposing our values on them?
Oh, I'm not criticizing them for having slaves. That's their society, and that was where, you know, but the point I'm making is that there's no place where it's written in stone, here are the moral values by which we should all live for all time.
So you can't really condemn slavery on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, can you?
That's right.
No, I do. I do. I think slavery is wrong. I think it's a bad thing.
But isn't that just an expression of your own socio-cultural situation that you were born in this?
That's right.
So it doesn't have any objective sort of validity.
No, it comes from our society. That's why I said that all of us, I'll give you an example. Today, right today, we are arguing about whether or not it is moral for the president to have lied about his sexual relationship. We're arguing about that. Is that a moral thing or not? We ourselves, all of us today, the senators, all of us who are voters, we are deciding whether what he did was a moral thing or not. And that's the way morals are created. In fact, I would say, and I would say, if you believe that you have some set of objective moral values, I would say, well, why should I believe that you have them? I mean, how are you going to know? Well, you're going to have to do the same thing as anybody else who has relative moral values to try to show why your values are better and right and they work correctly and they have this, all of those things you have to go, you can't tell the difference between absolute objective values and relative ones. It's just a fact.
You don't think that you can tell that we ought to love a child rather than torture and sexually abuse a child?
I think that's a good idea, to love a child. I think it's a good idea. It arises from our biological heritage. It's natural and normal for us.
But one isn't morally different from the other?
No, I think it's that they're morally different. It's bad to inflict harm. That's why I criticize God in the book of Job. He has inflicted unmerited, undeserved suffering on totally innocent people.
And you think that's
admits it
wrong
himself.
of God?
I think that's wrong of God.
On what basis do you make that value judgment?
I think it's bad to inflict suffering and a harm on other people.
Why?
What do you mean, why? I mean,
Why is that wrong on a naturalistic worldview? The Nazis thought it was all right to do that to
They
to
did.
Jews.
They did, and that's because morals are created by societies, and that society created a system that made those people see with such hatred, and we have many differences in moral opinions. In some Asian societies, such as in China and Japan, they're much more communitarian oriented than we are, and we're very individualistically oriented. Well, I mean, do I think that there's some place where it's written, here it is, you're supposed to be individualistic? I don't think so. Let's take specific example to discuss it. Is divorce moral? Let's ask that. Is divorce moral? In your absolute moral code, is divorce moral?
Well,
I think the issue here is anything, not just divorce, is anything right or wrong? And by your own philosophy, nothing is.
Now, you haven't answered my question.
No. Why divorce?
This is a pretty well-known debating tactic here, and I want to know, is divorce moral? That's the question. I'll answer that one. That's a yes or no question.
Very briefly, the Bible does lay down certain conditions prohibiting divorce and allowing divorce under other conditions. So, I mean, that's just a matter of, you can look in the Gospels and see what Jesus said. But honestly, Dr. Lycan, this isn't a debating tactic or trick. This is a fundamental philosophical question. Right. On the one hand, you want to make value judgments like God was wrong to do this to Job. Right. Slavery was abhorrent. We have improved morally over this other culture. Right. The Nazis were wrong. Right. And yet on the other hand, out of the other side of your mouth, you're affirming moral relativism. You have no transcendent anchor for these values, and hence you're lost in a sea of socio-cultural relativism.
You were correct in everything you said till you said I was lost.
All right.
That's why we invited you here.
I am.
I would argue that evil is actually indirect proof that God exists. Here's the proof. Number one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Atheists and theists concur on this. 2, evil exists. 3, therefore, objective values do exist. Some things are really evil. 4, therefore, God exists. So that paradoxically, even though evil in one sense calls into question God's existence, in a deeper sense, it actually demonstrates God's existence, because without God, there wouldn't be any foundation for calling anything evil.
Some people think that the most one of the most compelling arguments against the existence of God is that there's evil in the world. I actually think it's one of the best arguments in favor of the existence of God. And here's why. When people raise the problem of evil, I always ask them, what do they mean by evil? A lot of times they'll give illustrations of it. I say, no, I don't mean an illustration. I mean a definition. And then they're a little more hard-pressed. And when you think about it for a while, you realize that, well, what evil is that things aren't the way they ought to be. They aren't good like they should be, but they've departed from good. And so it turns out that evil is a departure from good. Now keep in mind that the objection for evil is based on the existence of evil as a real feature of the world. It's not just a difference of opinion of people's subjective preferences with morality. It is a matter of dealing with the real problem of evil in the world. Now, what this means then is if somebody raises the objection to the problem of evil, there must be a standard of good that is transcendent, that is in the world, from which evil turns out to be a departure. So somebody says there's a problem of evil, which means that somebody has departed from a standard of good. C.S. Lewis said, I wouldn't have known what crooked was unless I knew what straight was. You don't know a bad portrait unless you know what the original likeness was like, and the one doesn't match to the other. And it turns out then that in order for somebody to complain about the problem of evil, there must be some transcendent standard of good that it departs from. That, I think, can only be the case if God exists. So the irony is one can't even, in a coherent way at least, raise the question of the problem of evil unless there first is a God that gives a definition of what good is, and such evil that departs from it, raising problems for us. So the problem of evil depends upon the existence of God even to be a coherent problem. I think it should be answered, and I think it can be answered. But keep in mind that it doesn't even make sense to raise the problem unless God exists first to define what good is.
I think that the argument here is the old Euthyphro argument, which asks, is it moral because God says so, or does God say so because it's moral? And I think that's a false dilemma. I think the correct answer is to say that it's moral because that's the way God is. God's commands, which constitute our moral duties, are based upon his moral nature, which is essentially kind, loving, generous, just, and so forth. And this is the middle way through this Euthyphro dilemma. Natural science tells us only what is, not what ought to be the case. As philosopher Jerry Fodor has written, science is about facts, not norms. It might tell us how we are, but it wouldn't tell us what is wrong with how we are. In particular, it cannot tell us that we have a moral obligation to take actions which are conducive to human flourishing.